You're watching BBC Newsroom Live with me, Anita McVeigh, in Westminster. These are the main stories at midday. Theresa May pleads with European leaders as she fights to rescue her Brexit deal. She's met the Dutch Prime Minister this morning and now faces Angela Merkel a day after she cancelled the vote on her withdrawal deal. But she's facing an uphill battle as the EU insists it's not possible to renegotiate.
The deal we have achieved is the best deal possible. It's the only deal possible. And so we cannot... There is no room whatsoever for renegotiation.
Here in Westminster, MPs will hold an emergency debate within the hour on that decision to delay the Brexit vote. Our other top stories today: official figures show record numbers of people are in work and wages are at their highest level for a decade. France's President Macron promises to increase the minimum wage and offers tax concessions in response to weeks of violent protest. Thinning ice in Antarctica. NASA says it's worse than we thought, prompting fears of sea levels rising significantly around the world. Hello, a very good afternoon to you from Westminster. You can probably hear some of the noise behind me as demonstrators on both sides, those with Leave Means Leave banners, cheek by jowl with those holding the European flag. Here most days now at Westminster as the Brexit drama continues and as of course Theresa May begins that whistle-stop tour of the EU in a bid to rescue her Brexit deal. She's meeting the German Chancellor Angela Merkel about now and has held a breakfast meeting with the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte as she seeks new reassurances from the EU about the Northern Ireland backstop. There she is with Mr Rutte earlier. That backstop, the single biggest issue threatening the deal, designed of course to prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in the event of trade negotiations not panning out as both sides want. But the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, has said there is no room whatsoever for renegotiation. Well, later this afternoon the Prime Minister will meet the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk. Before that, back here in Westminster, there'll be a 3-hour emergency debate in the Commons. It's been called for by the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. I mentioned the European Commission President's comments. Let's hear a little bit more of what Mr Juncker had to say.
I will see Mrs May this evening, and I have to say here in the Parliament, as I did say before in this Parliament, the deal we have achieved is the best deal possible. It's the only deal possible. And so we cannot... There is no room whatsoever for renegotiation. But, of course, there is room, if used intelligently, is room enough to give further clarifications and further interpretations without opening the withdrawal agreement. This will not happen. Everyone has to know that the withdrawal agreement will not be reopened. The big problem, of course, is the backstop for Ireland. We have a common determination to do everything to be not in a situation one day to use that backstop. But we have to prepare it. It's necessary. It's necessary for the entire coherence of what we have agreed with Britain, and it's necessary for Ireland. Ireland will never be left alone.
Well, I think the Prime Minister is due to arrive for her meeting with Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, in Berlin. And indeed there is the motorcade carrying the Prime Minister to that meeting. These live pictures from Berlin coming to us just now. Obviously, Angela Merkel's opinion, one of the key opinions and key decision makers that Theresa May needs to get on board in terms of those reassurances that she is seeking from this round of meetings. But the Prime Minister has been very clear with her language. She hasn't talked about anything more than reassurances. Whether any reassurances, if they are forthcoming, can change any minds or influence any decisions when her vote, the vote on her deal eventually comes before Parliament, that's highly debatable, listening to the voices we've been talking to today. And as we watch these live pictures of Theresa May's arrival for that meeting with Angela Merkel, let's talk to our correspondent Damien McGuinness, who's in Berlin as well. Damien, how minded do you think Angela Merkel will be to offer reassurances to Theresa May?
She'll undoubtedly offer reassurances, but to be honest, Anita, not anything else, because the German government has been quite clear right throughout this whole process, really, ever since the referendum, but particularly recently, in fact, quite forthright in saying that Berlin supports the position taken by Brussels. On the one hand, Berlin has consistently always said, well, this is a negotiation between Brussels and London, and that's something you note in the German press as well. It's seen as very much a European matter between the EU and London, almost as if Germany doesn't have anything to do with it. And even today, this morning, government ministers here in Germany have said, well, this compromise deal between the EU and Theresa May will not be renegotiated. So they've been quite clear about that. There is a lot of sympathy for Theresa May. There's a certain amount of admiration that she's hung on so long. And there's certainly an awareness of the dangers of Britain leaving the EU without a deal, because German businesses are aware that the German economy would indeed take a hit. But that's almost being reported as an eventuality that can't be avoided if Britain leaves without a deal. And it's being seen here as something that's in the hands of the British, because there is complete unanimity, really, with the German press, the German government, and German voters you speak to as well, saying, well, this is a British domestic matter with the EU, and if the two sides can't come to an agreement, then Germany will support the EU, and that's quite clear. So some people are quite puzzled why Mrs. May is in fact visiting Angela Merkel today, because on previous visits, it's always been the same line, and it's not going to change today either. So it's doubtful, really, apart from reassurances, which Angela Merkel will give, it's doubtful whether anything more concrete can come out of it.
OK, Damien, thank you very much for that. We'll bring you more details of that meeting if we hear any of them. We didn't hear much about the meeting with Mark Rutte earlier today so far, but as those details emerge, of course, if they emerge, we will bring them to you. I was talking a few moments ago about the noises from the demonstrators here outside Parliament virtually every day these days with all the drama that's going on with Brexit. But we're just hearing some reports on the Reuters news agency that an individual has been tasered by police, or indeed held inside the grounds of Parliament in the last short while. Our political editor Laura Koonsberg is tweeting as well, intruder at Parliament being held by police. She says, not clear what happened, all seems calm now. So whatever has gone on, the incident has been dealt with fairly quickly, it seems. Some details emerging about a man being held, arguing with police. Laura Koonsberg says that he was on the ground when she first saw him, but was then on his feet in handcuffs, talking to officers. Some reports as well suggesting that someone was tasered. We don't have absolute clarity on that, but whatever was going on has been dealt with and contained. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Adam Fleming, who's in Brussels. Adam, Theresa May heading there later. We saw her just a second ago being greeted by Angela Merkel in Berlin. What sort of reception can she expect there? What can she expect in terms of reassurances from Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk when she meets them?
Well, the EU and the member states are prepared to provide reassurance. They're prepared to interpret aspects of the withdrawal agreement, but they are not prepared to reopen the document itself. So I think probably the territory we're in is a note from the European Council, or some legal advice from one of the EU institutions, or some letters being exchanged that would clarify the situation as regards the Northern Irish backstop and how it would operate in the future. And I thought it was notable that in Theresa May's Commons statement yesterday, all the details she gave was about what would happen on the domestic side. It would be the role of the British Parliament. And so I wonder if a lot of what Theresa May is doing today is saying to these leaders, right, this is what I think I should offer the British Parliament. Can we get that written down so it is guaranteed to MPs that this is the role they will have in the process? I suppose we'll probably get some more details today, because the gears are starting to turn in Brussels in preparation for the meeting of EU leaders on Thursday and Friday, which will now have a big Brexit element. As part of the preparation for that summit, European affairs ministers from across Europe have been in Brussels today for the General Affairs Council. So we had an opportunity to ask them for their reactions to both Theresa May dropping the parliamentary vote yesterday, and also to see what they might be prepared to offer her. This is what Michael Roth, the German Europe minister, had to say on the red carpet when he arrived this morning. Are you sick of us?
Ich bin traurig. It's so sad. It's a really, really sad situation, not just for the people in the United Kingdom, but also for us in the EU 27. And because we are very much interested in close and reliable relations to the United Kingdom, and I hope we can continue our very good cooperation and friendship.
And will Chancellor Merkel do anything to help today, or is it a waste of time?
It's always good to talk to each other.
So two things there. First of all, he wasn't incredibly enthusiastic about anything big coming out of that meeting that's about to happen in Berlin between Theresa May and Angela Merkel. And second of all, doesn't the body language speak volumes there? When I said, "Are you sick of us?" and he shrugged his shoulders, it took him ages to find the words to describe how he actually felt. That does reflect a real sense of kind of Brexit fatigue that you pick up from people here in Brussels when you ask them about what's happening.
Yes, the body language does indeed speak volumes. Adam, thank you very much. Adam Fleming in Brussels. Let's just show you some shots from a camera looking down towards just a very short distance from where we are, obviously, the area around Parliament. Quite a melee of people coming and going there. You can see a police car parked halfway on the pavement, but we are somewhere around this area that the individual we were talking about a few moments ago has been held by police. It follows some sort of words being exchanged. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, saying that she saw a man arguing with police. He was on the ground when she first saw him, and then was on his feet in handcuffs talking to officers. There was some suggestion also, some reports coming in that someone had been tasered. We can't absolutely clarify that, and that someone was within the grounds of Parliament, but whether they were inside walls, inside the perimeter, or just outside, it's a little unclear at the moment. But just that view from that camera overlooking Parliament for you now. If we get any more details on that, of course, and we'll try to find out what exactly was going on there, whether it's one of the demonstrators. They've been out in force here at Westminster in recent weeks. Whether it was one of those demonstrators, we simply don't know at the moment. We'll have more on today's main stories coming up for you on Newsroom Live here on the BBC News Channel, including much more on Brexit, of course. But right now, goodbye to viewers on BBC Two. And let's continue our Brexit coverage now with our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. So we haven't heard much about Theresa May's meeting with Mark Rutte. She's just arrived, as we saw a few moments ago, for the meeting with Angela Merkel. What do you think her strategy is with all of this?
Well, I think she knows she's not going to get any fundamental rewrite of the deal. That's been made pretty clear. I think she is sceptical about the risks involved in reopening it and whether it would just be a sort of open invitation for the EU to pile in and make a whole load of demands. So the best she can expect in terms of the deal, bluntly, is a bit of warm words around the margin to try and ease the concerns of Tory Brexiteers. Her greatest weapon, though, is time. And the fact that the clock is now ticking down to Brexit Day. And we've learned this morning that number 10 say she will come back with her meaningful vote before January the 21st. Now, that is not going to assuage her critics because that is still 6 weeks away. So there is the potential for Mrs May to drag this out for another 6 weeks before MPs actually get a say. That means when they vote, they are getting towards the buffers of exit day. There really is no more spare time to come up with some sort of plan B. So MPs will be forced to decide whether to go with Mrs May's deal or to risk no deal or potentially no Brexit. And I think bluntly her hope is that a number of MPs on both sides of the divide will crack, and you will have softer Brexiteers who will say, look, I really don't want to put Brexit at risk, I'll just go with Mrs May's deal. And you will get former Remainers saying, cannot possibly risk no deal, we'll just go with Mrs May's deal. So time is Mrs May's key weapon to get this deal through.
And we have, though, the other view that we've always had from, indeed, some within the Conservative Party, from some within Labour, the SNP, the Greens, the Lib Dems and others, that there is an alternative to the options that Theresa May is setting out.
They are now, it seems to me, trying to concentrate their efforts in trying to manage a no-confidence vote. And we've got all the opposition parties now, with the exception of Labour, saying, yes, let's do it. Jeremy Corbyn is holding back from tabling a no-confidence motion because he fears if he does it now, quite simply, Mrs May will win and they will have blown their opportunity. So for tactical reasons, he is holding back. The other opposition parties take the view that now is the moment, and if he doesn't act now, he will indeed find himself in the position of having to vote for no deal or Mrs May's deal. So their argument is go for it now. Mr Corbyn is holding back. There is a second reason why Team Corbyn is holding back, and that is if they blow it now, then they are almost forced by default to start moving towards a second referendum. That will be the only option they've got left. If they've tried a no-confidence vote and lost it, they've urged Mrs May to go back and renegotiate. She's doing that. So the only thing remaining that will be open to them is going for a second referendum. And we know Mr Corbyn, those around him, deeply wary of pressing the button for a second referendum because of fears about the impact that will have in Leave-supporting Labour constituencies. So at the moment, he's sort of sitting on the fence, just waiting to see how this unfolds.
Do you think that plays well to what Theresa May is trying to do, bluntly?
I think her problems actually probably are a little more sharp and immediate and come from behind her rather than the opposition benches, because it's quite clear there is a renewed push by hardline Tory Brexiteers to get rid of Mrs May. We had Steve Baker, the Deputy Chairman of the European Research Group, saying this morning to Tory MPs, look, let's start writing those letters again. Let's have a real go to get rid of Mrs May, because their view, quite simply, is she cannot negotiate a better deal. If you stick with Mrs May, you'll just get her deal with a little bit of language around the margins. If you want a new deal, you want a different course, we're going to need a new leader. And so they are now trying to get these 48 letters. We know they tried a few weeks ago, failed. This time they're having a renewed push. The question mark is, how do you manage this with exit day looming? Talking to some of the Brexiteers, they're now suggesting you could have a very fast leadership contest over the Christmas recess even, which is done and dusted within 2 or 3 weeks. You come back in January, new leader, new strategy, new Brexit deal. All a long way off. They have to get those 48 letters, but that, I think, is the immediate threat to Mrs May.
And just a final thought, Norman, the 29th of March then as the date on which the UK leaves the EU, do you think that could slip?
It's possible, yes. I mean, frankly, anything is possible given where we currently are. if we get to Mrs May's meaningful vote on, say, the 20th of January, and if there are not sufficient concessions, and if it goes down, then a lot of people are going to balk at the idea that we will automatically go to no deal. So you will see MPs trying, there's Hilary Benn's amendment, to engineer a majority to avoid no deal at all costs. And if they do that, they are going to have to extend Article 50 to buy more time. But, you know, bluntly, nothing is off the table. You know, as they used to say in Stingray, anything can happen in the next half an hour, and it's pretty much like that with Brexit. Anything can happen.
OK. Norman, thank you very much. Norman Smith. Well, Norman was just talking about Hilary Benn there. I spoke to him. He is the chair of the Brexit Select Committee, of course. I spoke to him a little earlier and began by asking him if Labour waiting to move a vote of no confidence against the Prime Minister was a good decision.
I think that is a sensible decision. The Prime Minister is touring around Europe to try and see if he can bring something back further on the deal. I think the moment to consider such a motion of no confidence would be after this deal is voted on. And although she might come back with a piece of paper, a codicil, exchange of letters, saying we don't want to use the backstop, you don't, we'll try and sort it out, I'm not sure that is going to be sufficient to rescue her deal when the vote is finally brought before the Commons. And I have to say, we're in a crisis as a country, and the Prime Minister faced humiliation yesterday. The nation may face humiliation if we don't find a way forward, and if this deal is not going to pass, then the sooner we get on to look at the alternatives, the better for the future of the country. And I don't think she can wait until the new year to finally ask Parliament to vote on her deal.
Yes, in your heart and mind, do you really think that, you know, she's going to get any sort of reassurances? She may get reassurances, she may get a slightly different form of words as a result of these meetings today, but is that going to change the minds of her critics, do you think?
I think in her party probably not, because any words of reassurance will be compared with the legal text in Article 20 of the Northern Ireland backstop, and that will remain because the EU has been pretty clear we're not going to change the words of the withdrawal agreement. So I suspect those critics will say, well, that's all very well and good, but you haven't changed what we object to.
And in Labour? I mean, Labour saying they, you know, colleagues of yours saying that they want to see whether she comes back with some tweaks to the deal. But is that what Labour really wants? It's not what Labour wants as a party in terms of unanimity, is it?
No, because, I mean, my problem is not really with the withdrawal agreement. We've got to protect citizens' rights, we owe money, we've got to have a transition period. And since the Prime Minister created the problem of the border in Northern Ireland by saying we're leaving the single market and the customs union, she's now being skewered on her policy that started the negotiations, which have led to all of the problems that she's faced. No, it's about the lack of clarity about the future. She's asking the country to take a step into the unknown, and the Brexit Select Committee, which I chair, in our unanimous report, and we made up of people who campaigned for leave and remain back in June 2016, we said with one voice, this doesn't provide us with certainty about the future, and that is the fundamental problem with the Prime Minister's deal. And why is there that problem? Because the government has steadfastly refused for 2 years to be honest with the nation about the choices that we face.
Hilary Benn, the chair of the Brexit Select Committee, talking to me earlier today. Let's get more on that situation around the gates of Parliament that we've been telling you about in the last short while, with reports that a man was tasered after a disturbance of some sort. I can talk now to Christopher Hope, who's the chief political correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, and he joins me now on the line from the Houses of Parliament. And Christopher, I understand you saw some of this unfolding. Take us through what you saw.
That's right, Anita. Well, the press gallery is really next to Big Ben, overlooks Parliament Square, and I heard a scream and then looked out the window, and then about half a dozen police officers who appeared not to be armed were running towards a man who was, from my angle, behind the Christmas tree, that famous Christmas tree that you see in New Palace Yard outside the House of Parliament. And then it appears the man was tasered. It's taken about a quarter of an hour for Parliament to get organised, but now they appear to have shut carriage gates, and the exit for people who work in the House of Commons is now through the House of Lords entrance. But it looks, it was, you know, obviously reminiscent of what happened last year when I'm afraid to say we saw the horror of the murder of PC Keith Palmer, and all that. It appears to be contained now. There are armed police patrolling downstairs by the Christmas tree. I understand from colleagues on the ground that the man has now been put into a van and may have been taken away. But it shows how on edge people like can be here in the Palace of Westminster.
So for clarity's sake and for our viewers' sake, this was someone who was inside the perimeter of Parliament's grounds.
He appears to have got through the gates that the cars drive through and get into New Palace Yard, and he was tased. Well, we think he was tasered inside the estate. That's right.
Yes, just as I talk to you, Christopher, we've got some new pictures, some new images coming into us of an individual on the ground with several police officers around him, some other police officers standing nearby with batons at the ready, but this individual clearly contained by the officers who are holding him on the ground at the moment. And it is quite a melee down in that area, isn't it, Christopher? You have obviously all the normal comings and goings, lots of tourists, lots of demonstrators here because of Brexit as well.
Yes, it does feel febrile at the moment in Westminster, and this is another reminder that this place can feel a bit under siege sometimes. Maybe MPs feel under siege, and certainly this is an interruption on a strange day as ever that they could do without.
OK, Christopher, thank you very much. Christopher Hope from the Daily Telegraph telling us what he saw, and our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, joins me on the line now, also saw some of this thing. Laura, tell us.
Anita, hello. I'm talking to you from Old Palace Yard, which is just inside the gates at the front of Westminster, so only 20 metres or so from Big Ben, for our viewers who are not familiar with how the estate works. About 20 minutes ago, I was due to be coming into Parliament to talk to MPs about what's unfolding here politically. And when I arrived here, I saw a man on the ground. He had been somehow brought to the ground by police. He was then held by police here. There were a dozen or so police holding him. He was continuing to argue and shout at them. We saw police gathering up his belongings, what looked to me like a passport and a few other bits and pieces that were taken, presumably as evidence by the police. And in the last few minutes, he's just been bundled into a police van and taken away. But obviously, huge sensitivities around all of this, not just because of the normal security concerns of Westminster, but because this is almost precisely the spot where, of course, there was that terror attack where PC Keith Palmer actually lost his life when somebody made it into the parliamentary estate a while ago.
Laura, did you have any sense in the melee of what this man was shouting about? Was it anything to do with the Brexit demonstrations, or perhaps you didn't quite manage to hear that?
I couldn't hear any to what he was arguing or shouting back. He didn't have with him any sort of paraphernalia that would have suggested that he was associated with any one particular cause. He's a man who looked to me to be in his sort of late 20s or early 30s, and has certainly caused a lot of commotion. But as I say, to be completely clear, not obvious at all what he was trying to achieve, if he was trying to just mount some kind of protest or if he had more sinister motives. We just do not know that at this stage.
OK, well, Laura, thank you very much for describing what you saw. Laura Koonsberg there, our political editor, talking about seeing an individual, a man, being dealt with by police after getting inside the perimeter of Parliament through gates which traffic normally comes through, and you can see from these images on your screen right now that individual being held on the ground by police officers, the situation contained. Of course, as we hear more, if we hear more about what unfolded there, we will let you know. But right now, let's return to Brexit-related business, and we can talk to John Tong, Professor John Tong, Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool. Good to talk to you, as always, John. What do you make of where we're at right now? It's been an extraordinary 24 hours or so in a period when we've had so many extraordinary days.
Yeah, Theresa May identified the main problem correctly yesterday in her statement to the House of Commons. The backstop has always been the main problem. And the EU are not bluffing when they say that the treaty simply won't be amended. But there may be some scope for compromise, and this is still a long shot, but it's a possibility that some sort of addendum or some sort of appendix or some sort of new protocol could be added to the existing treaties, which would reassure some of the doubters, in particular the DUP, but Brexiteers more broadly, about the nature of the Irish backstop. At the moment, the plan is that the backstop will kick in if there's no deal by the 31st of December 2020. And the fears, therefore, of Brexiteers are realistic in the sense that there probably won't be a comprehensive trade deal with the European Union by the end of December 2020. So that issue does need addressing. What would an extra appendix do? Well, perhaps there could be some sort of bolstered mechanism in which the cases of the UK, if they wanted to leave the backstop, or the cases of the EU, if they wanted to retain the backstop, would go to some sort of independent arbitration, some sort of customs arbitration. Because that's the only thing I can think of, because domestic tinkering, as Arlene Foster, the DUP, put it, that's not going to work. Parliament could vote by 650 votes to 0 to end the backstop, but under the current legislation, that simply isn't going to pass muster. So the backstop needs to be addressed. The question is, how far now will the EU be flexible? Not much, I would reckon.
And if there was some kind of appendix or addendum, would that have to be legally binding? And all the suggestions from Europe are that they won't be making any serious concessions for the Prime Minister, merely words of reassurance. Would it have to be legally binding to convince the sternest critics of her deal?
Yes, I think any appendix, if it materialises, would have to be legally binding. There's not much point in having simply a set of warm words. You've already got lots of warm words in the political declaration that has been signed off. Frankly, for the Brexiteers, not just within the DUP, they actually want to see the legalese, as it were, what is actually written in a particular treaty. Now, whether Theresa May can extract that, given the weakness of her negotiating position, is open to question. I mean, we were promised a meaningful vote yesterday, but in one sense the vote, even if it had taken place yesterday, would have been meaningless, because the deal was already signed, sealed and delivered. Now, the question is, you can try and exit with no deal, but there's palpably no Commons majority for that. So that really only leaves two viable alternatives. One would be a second referendum, or the other would be Norway Plus, which is simply too close to EU minus for Brexiteers.
Pluses and minuses. Well, let's move away from those sternest critics of the deal, Professor Tong, and think about the more middle of the road, if I can use that expression, MPs who want to avoid no deal, who want to avoid no Brexit. Do you think that they might be sort of squeezed into a situation whereby Theresa May's deal is the only deal open to them, perhaps with some extra reassurances?
Yeah, I think Theresa May will try in the new year to come back with a modified version of the deal, and that very much depends upon what happens in the next 48 hours in Brussels. But the alternatives beyond that, if she can't sell the deal, are pretty stark. We could apply, there could be an amendment tabled in the Commons to delay departure beyond the 29th of March, and I think that would probably command a majority in the House of Commons. That buys time in the short term while we try and sort ourselves out. So I think that's a distinct possibility. I would say
are the options, sorry to interrupt, but are the options as stark as you say? Because clearly the people behind the People's Vote campaign are trying to get the message out there that there are other ways, other routes to follow.
If we go down the People's Vote / second referendum option, there would have to be an extension to the date of departure anyway. You would probably need an absolute minimum, and this is the absolute minimum, of 14 weeks to organise such a referendum. So it's not doable anyway to depart on the 29th of March. I actually think that's the least of our problems, because the EU would readily accept a revised proposed date of departure subject to a second referendum. I think it's been significant that the odds have been shortening hugely on the prospect of a second referendum taking place. I think it's probably now favourite in terms of the way forward, because if Parliament can't decide, the people will have to. But let's not pretend that this would be anything other than hugely divisive. And there are huge potential complications in terms of the wording. Last time we had a binary referendum. This time a binary option might not be on the ballot paper. There may be a multi-option referendum with all the complications and all the difficulties that would bring. So the idea that that's somehow a panacea, the idea of a second vote, I think is for the birds.
Would it, though, in your opinion, be democratic or anti-democratic to have that second referendum, given that MPs can't agree on a deal after 2.5 years of negotiations?
I think it's an option of desperation, by the virtue of the fact that Parliament doesn't appear to have a majority for anything other than to have not exit without a deal. I think the difficulty really is how you would frame that second referendum. And there are those 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit who will be enraged. And where do we go? Do we go to a best-of-3 model if there is a vote narrowly to remain this time? I mean, the country is obviously entitled to think again on this, and clearly a lot of information about the nature of our Brexit and some of the difficulties of that Brexit have come to light since 2016. So you can make an intellectual and political case for a second referendum, but you know, it will inflame division rather than bring healing to the country if we do go down that route. I still think it's the likeliest route now, but let's not pretend that it's going to be easy. And I think that, you know, the people's vote tend to overlook the difficulties. What happens if the result is very, very close again?
OK, Professor John Tong, all good questions and thoughts from you. Thank you very much, Professor John Tong from the University of Liverpool. Well, it's 12:35. Let's just take stock of where we are with this day so far after a hugely dramatic day at Westminster yesterday. We have heard from a spokesman for the Prime Minister that she says she will bring her deal back to Parliament for a vote by the 21st of January. Of course, it could slip again. The Prime Minister has said certain things will happen before and they haven't happened, but she is saying by the 21st of January. It does look as though that is being pushed towards the new year. Let's just take a look inside the Commons as well, where we are expecting an urgent question from Labour's Yvette Cooper. It relates, in fact, to the idea of what is the latest point the Prime Minister could bring her deal back for a vote, for a meaningful vote in the House of Commons. She is putting that urgent question, asking the Attorney General about that point, with some suggestions earlier today that, you know, this could really go right up to the wire, that wire being the 29th of March, the day that the UK is due to depart from the European Union. Meanwhile, of course, the Prime Minister is talking to a number of European leaders, the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte earlier, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel currently, and later on, of course, we'll talk to leading EU officials Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk, seeking those reassurances that she was talking about yesterday, reassurances around the backstop designed to prevent a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland in the event of no trade deal being reached after Brexit. Whether those reassurances will make a jot of difference to any of the MPs as they prepared to vote yesterday, whether it will make a jot of difference to them in a future vote, well, it sounds unlikely based on what we have heard today. But, you know, the Prime Minister is obviously convinced that she can still change some minds. Well, earlier I spoke to the former leader of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan-Smith, and I asked him what his expectations are of the Prime Minister today in Brussels.
I think what the Prime Minister has to do is convey to them the reality that their deal will no longer be on the table if they don't give her what she's after. And what she's after, and should be after, I believe, is to say to them, this backstop that exists right now, this Northern Ireland backstop, is intolerable because it puts Northern Ireland separately outside the UK. And secondly, it also means that we have a problem because we can't leave it, and that it will be an absolute constitutional first for us. And Germany wouldn't accept that, France wouldn't accept that for themselves. Why should we accept that? And they need to resolve that, and that doesn't cost them anything. What will cost them, she should say, is if this deal doesn't go ahead, because they won't get their 39 billion, they'll have a huge black hole, and also at the same time they'll end up with a process where we won't have those sort of arrangements which suit them and suit their businesses.
But why would the EU27, after 2.5 years or thereabouts of negotiation, do anything that places the Republic of Ireland at a disadvantage, if that's what this would mean?
But the Republic of Ireland won't be at a disadvantage. What we've presented, a group of myself, including customs expert and trade lawyers, have written a protocol and trade chapter for the EU, We went and saw them over this. We've actually seen the government. The open borders policy, which was originally being started, by the way, by Enda Kenny, the previous Taoiseach in Ireland. It was Mr Varadkar that came in and insisted that they had this ludicrous backstop, and the EU just went along with it. And the reality is that they know that it will, at the end, have to come down to having just a commitment to open borders, and all the processes that exist at the moment enable that to happen. Let me give you one example. In Rotterdam at the moment, the biggest port in Europe, they spot check only 1.5% of all non-EU goods coming in, and they don't even do that at the border. So there is absolutely no requirement to have this backstop pressed upon the UK. The European Union knows it, and so does Mr Varadkar, but he's playing a game for Irish politics, and that needs to stop. And the UK has to say to them, you are putting at risk your own settlement. Your own money that we were supposed to be giving you will not be coming across to the EU if you don't agree something. And it's not major, it's not massive, just means that they need to agree that they won't go along with this, and they'll have an open borders policy.
Ian Duncan-Smith, just while we wait for that urgent question from Yvette Cooper, let me bring you this update from the Metropolitan Police in the last couple of minutes about that incident at Carriage Gates, just inside the perimeter of Parliament, where a man was arrested earlier. The Met saying a man was arrested by Carriage Gates inside the Palace of Westminster on suspicion of trespassing on a protected site. That was at around 11:55, just before midday. The police confirming that a taser was used, and the Met says inquiries into the circumstances continue. We've heard from our colleague Laura Koonsberg, our political editor, and other journalists about hearing a scream and shouting, and then seeing officers surround a man. There was a lot of shouting, but officers quickly contained the individual, held him on the ground. It has caused some disruption to normal business, but you can see there actually in that shot, that last shot, one of the officers holding a taser, armed police officers and also police officers with batons at the ready, containing this man very quickly. Memories of the attack on PC Keith Palmer, of course, the fatal attack on PC Keith Palmer, very much in everyone's minds as this incident unfolded today, although it sounds as though it was dealt with very, very quickly. We do not know what the circumstances of this incident were. Just to repeat that line from the Metropolitan Police, saying that inquiries into the circumstances continue. There are a lot of people around Parliament on a daily basis, demonstrators, tourists. We just don't know why this man was inside the grounds. He managed to get in through Carriage Gates, where cars normally come and go through, but security obviously a priority around the Palace of Westminster following last year's attack. But clearly there are perhaps weak spots that can be exploited, as today's incident seems to demonstrate. So those are the latest comments from the Metropolitan Police on that incident just before noon today at Carriage Gates inside the Palace of Westminster. We can go inside the House of Commons now with that urgent question from Yvette Cooper. Is happening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recognise that this question, which was the subject of much discussion and some speculation yesterday, and so I hope to be able to put honourable members and the right honourable ladies' concerns at ease. Put simply, in keeping with the clear intention of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, the government will ensure that the question of whether to accept is brought back to this House before the 21st of January. If Parliament accepts that deal, we will introduce the EU Withdrawal Agreement Bill to implement the withdrawal agreement in domestic legislation. If Parliament were to reject the deal, the government will be required to make a statement on its proposed next steps and table a motion in neutral terms on that statement. Following the passage of the amendment to the Business of the House motion last week, that motion So it is our clear intention that this House will consider this matter before the 21st of January and have the opportunity to decide on the deal. But let me also say this clearly. In the unlikely and highly undesirable circumstances that as of the 21st of January there is no deal before the House, the government would bring a statement to the House and arrange for a debate as specified by the law. I am confident that we will have a deal that this House can support, and I hope that the statement puts the rest of the concerns of honourable members about the government's commitment to meet the spirit as well as the letter of the Withdrawal Act and to respect the will of this House.
Yvette Cooper.
I thank the Minister for those assurances, but also say to him that in the current circumstances those are not enough. The reason that I asked this question to the Attorney General because we need to know the government's legal interpretation of Section 13 of the Act, and also to be assured that legally the government will abide by the spirit of that Act as well. Because now that the government has pulled the vote, we don't know when a vote will come or even whether a vote will come on the deal. Number 10 official spokesman said this morning that it will come by the 21st January, and the Minister said it would come by the 21st of January. However, yesterday morning the Environment Secretary, who is sitting on the front bench, told us and confirmed that the vote was 100% going to happen. And yesterday at 11 o'clock, number 10 spokesperson said the vote is going ahead. By 3:30 the Prime Minister had pulled it. These warm words are therefore not enough when so much is at stake. Who knows? And this goes for the Cabinet and all of the benches opposite as well. None of us know whether the Prime Minister is going to pull the vote again or whether she is even going to table a vote on the deal again. So if we get to the 21st of January and there is no deal, the agreement of Parliament was that the government should make a statement and Parliament should be able to vote on it and that it should be amendable. Now, the Minister said that if, in the unlikely event, there is no deal, that would happen. However, we need urgent assurance from the Attorney General that the government will not find a loophole in this by saying that there is a deal, even though we haven't voted on it, and thereby avoiding the requirements of Section 13, subsections 7 to 11, which would require the vote by the 21st of January. Now, in other words, by never quite getting round to offering a vote on this deal until it is too late, but also not having a vote on no deal, keeping us in limbo. No vote on the deal and no vote on no deal. If the government were to do this, it would be a constitutional outrage. It would be upending the spirit of the Withdrawal Agreement Act, but much worse, it would be letting the country either drift or forcing the country into no deal without a parliamentary vote. So we need written assurances from the Attorney General on the government's interpretation of the Act, and we need that assurance that even if there has been no vote on this deal, even if they're still claiming that the deal applies, if there has been no vote on the deal by the 21st of January, then the government will still abide by Section 13, subsections 7 to 11, and ensure there is a statement and an amendable vote on its plans, including whether or not this means no deal, and that will happen under any circumstances by the 21st of January. Now, I make no apology, Mr. Speaker, for my purpose in doing this. I already think that the 21st of January is far too late for businesses and departments who will already be thinking that they've got to chuck everything at preparing for no deal. But I want to stop this country careering into no deal, either by accident or by deliberate intention of the government, with all of the damaging consequences for jobs, for prosperity and for our national security, without Parliament having a and without Parliament being able to stop that happening. Even if other members do not agree with me in that purpose, I hope they will agree that this Parliament cannot be ignored, and that is why we need the Attorney General's written advice.
Well, I have great respect for the Right Honourable Lady, and I understand that she came to this House expecting to have a row about the government's interpretation of this, and I understand the questions that she has just asked. But what I would say is I have responded to this question as my department is responsible for the legislation which enacts this, and which I have given her a very clear interpretation of that legislation, which is that we will have a vote in House, a motion before this House by the 21st of January. And that is in all those different scenarios that I talked through in my statement. So the answer is very clear for her. We respect the decisions which were made by this House, but the government should come back to the House with a motion in the event that no deal had been agreed, or in the event that this House had rejected a deal. That was clear from my statement. What we are therefore saying is that there will be that motion by the 21st of January, and I agree with her. I would much rather, and I fully expect it to be sooner, and I fully expect this House to have the opportunity to debate a withdrawal agreement that this House will be able to support. And so let us work together to achieve that, but let us not allow some of the conspiracy theories and the scare stories that have been told about this to run away when I have just clarified the government's position.
Nicky Morgan.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I have great sympathy for the points made by both the Minister, who I think is acting with integrity, as he always has done in his parliamentary career, but also for the points made by the Honourable Lady. It is unquestionable that this Parliament must have a say, a meaningful vote on the deal or no deal that comes about. Can the Minister give categorical assurance that there will be no trickery by the government to stop Parliament having a say?
No trickery. Well, Minister, my right honourable friend, and I'm grateful for her words. I'm very happy to give that categorical assurance. As I think my statement reflected, we will be putting before Parliament a motion, even in the circumstances where no deal was before the House. But I strongly believe and expect that there will be a deal before this House, which I will be urging Parliament to support.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, for applying for this urgent question, and to you, Mr. Speaker, for granting it. I'm grateful to the Minister's response, but the reality is that the Attorney-General should be here to speak about the legal implications of this agreement. Yesterday, the Prime Minister used the phrase in this House of an accidental no deal. That she used the phrase is itself evidence of a dereliction of leadership, Mr. Speaker. Section 13 of the European Withdrawal Act is therefore crucial in this House being able to prevent a chaotic no-deal outcome which would do enormous damage to our security, our economy and our society. So can the Minister answer these questions? The Prime Minister's official spokesperson has reiterated today that the government will bring back the meaningful vote by the 21st of January. Isn't it completely contrary to the national interest for the Prime Minister to run down another 6 weeks on the clock when all she is seeking is reassurances and clarification on a document that Parliament already understands? And if we are relying on the government's word, or to use the Minister's phrase, its clear intention that the government will keep the 21st of January deadline, rather than the clear force of the law, doesn't the Minister understand that this week of all weeks that constitutes no reassurance at all? Yesterday, the Prime Minister was unable to properly answer questions about the legal force of the 21st of January deadline, and the Leader of the House could not properly answer questions about the legal status and force of the amendment of the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman for Beaconsfield. Let me just say, the reassurance that was just given by the Minister means nothing without the legal backing of the Attorney-General, who isn't here. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that this decision to pull the vote was made in a panicked haste without thinking through the economic, political and constitutional implications for our country?
Minister Walker.
Well, the honourable gentleman made my point very clearly when he said that, yes, the Prime Minister's spokesman has said the same thing as I said this morning from the dispatch box, that there will be such a meaningful vote before the House before the 21st of January. He also talked about acting contrary to the national interest, and I think we're very clear on what acting contrary to the national interest is Labour's approach of blindly opposing sensible steps that are taken by the government to secure a deal while proposing no alternatives.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his statement. Can I just pick him up on a couple of points? The first one is this. Section 13 procedure presupposes that the government has an initialled deal with the European Union. And of course we have such an initial deal, which is why we started debate on it last week for the purpose of deciding whether the House should or should not approve it. In those circumstances, can he provide an assurance to the House that if the initial deal is continuing in its current form, then in those as initialed, the House can complete its consideration not on a day just before the 21st of January, but expeditiously, as was clearly provided for under the Act. Secondly, may I also take it from what he said that the government now accepts that the amendment that was tabled